My name is Lucy Pinches. I'm Project Manager of the Mine Action Review, and I'm delighted to be chairing today's launch of Mine Action Review's policy brief on mitigating the environmental impacts of explosive ordnance and land release. With the Climate Change Conference, COP26, set to start on Monday, the world's attention is really on the environment, and it's a timely moment for the mine action sector to also reflect on key environmental considerations of our work. It's great to see so many colleagues from across the sector joining us. I can see national authorities, donors, clearance operators, UNMAS, UNDP, UN Environment Programme, Geneva Centre, ICRC and others. So great to have such good attendance this morning or this afternoon for colleagues in Southeast Asia. Thank you to all of those that have contributed or commented on the policy brief, which we wanted to be a consultative and collaborative approach. Many thanks also to the governments of Norway, Switzerland and Canada for funding Mine Action Review and making our work possible. Before I introduce and hand over to our panelists, I'd like to just say a few quick words on why Mine Action Review has produced this policy brief. So, as mentioned, environmental considerations are rightly gaining increased prominence and awareness. Experts agree that unprecedented changes in climate and biodiversity are taking place, threatening nature and human livelihoods around the world. And as the humanitarian community increasingly understands that there's a need to identify and assess how operations will affect the natural environment and to mitigate the negative environmental impacts where possible. And the mine action sector is no exception. So affected communities clearly benefit from the removal of explosive ordnance. Clearance saves lives, limbs and livelihoods and enables land to be safely returned to productive use. It goes without saying that mines, cluster munition remnants and other explosive ordnance need to be located and destroyed. However, long-term harm can also be caused when there's environmental mismanagement. So environmental impacts were first reported by the mine action sector more than 30 years ago. And in recent years, the sector has begun to engage ever more meaningfully with the topic. The IMAS on the environment, which was published in 2017, and then there's some great initiative and resources and excellent initiatives taking place on the environment in affected countries around the world. However, we found that the information on this topic was quite scattered and was quite hard to access, making it quite difficult to clearly see what the full breadth of issues is that we're talking about. So the policy brief builds on existing knowledge and research. It aims to present the key issues in an accessible format while offering recommendations for measures that could improve environmental management practices within the sector. While it is not fully comprehensive, we do hope that it serves as an important tool for national authorities and their implementing partners as they seek to identify and minimise their environmental footprint. And lastly, we really hope that it helps promote discussion and stimulates further research, data gathering and sharing of lessons learned. If you haven't already seen it, the policy brief is available on the homepage of the Mine Action Review website. I've also put a link in the chat box. So that's www.mineactionreview.org. And we encourage people to take a read. So I'll be chairing today's session and I'm delighted to now introduce you to today's panelists. So we'll be starting off with my colleague Alex Frost, who has been a researcher for Mine Action Review since 2018 and is author of the policy brief we're launching today. She has a master's in global health, conflict and security from King's College London, where she's also a visiting research fellow. And Alex will be presenting the policy brief and highlighting the key findings. We'll then hear from Linsey Cottrell, who's Environmental Policy Officer at the Conflict and Environment Observatory, CEOBS. This is a UK-based charity working to raise awareness about the environmental impact of conflicts and increase protection for people and ecosystems. Her current role includes working with MPA on environmental safeguarding across disarmament programs. And Linsey is a chartered environmentalist and has worked in the environmental consultancy sector for over 20 years before joining CEOBS. Then we'll hear next from Martin Jebens, who is working as a weapon contamination advisor consultant for the ICRC Weapon Contamination Unit, and the ICRC delegation of Japan, where he is leading a project on how remote sensing and AI can improve detection of weapons and can be used for other humanitarian needs. Previously, Martin worked in the field of disaster risk management. He's got a strong focus on innovation, improved coordination and planning to reduce risk. And he uses IHL, the SDGs, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction as guiding tools. He's got a background in mine action as a GIS manager and in environmental protection. And it was actually Martin that drafted IMAS 713 on environmental management. So we're in good hands. And last but not least, there is Tim Horner. We'll be hearing from Tim Horner, who works for Norwegian People's Aid and is the Senior Technical Advisor to the Vietnam government, embedded in the Vietnam National Mine Action Centre. Tim advises Vietnam on policy and programmatic aspects of survey clearance, EOD, risk education, victim assistance, and new technologies and methodologies. Tim served in the British military as an EOD diver before starting humanitarian mine clearance in 1992. And he's worked in numerous countries, including Afghanistan, Angola, the Balkans, Somalia, and Southeast Asia, and with several NGOs, commercial companies, and UN agencies. So that's our panel. And now I would like to hand over to my colleague, Alex, to present the report. Thank you.
Can you see my screen okay?
We can, thanks, Alex.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. So as Lucy said, I'll be talking about the Mine Action Review policy brief today, mitigating the environmental impacts of explosive ordnance and land release. So I'll be covering these 5 sections of the brief, starting with environmental impacts of explosive ordnance contamination. So how does explosive ordnance contamination impact the environment? When an explosive ordnance detonates, it can cause soil degradation. As you can see from the diagram on the right, the blast generates a crater in the soil, which displaces the fertile topsoil, making it more susceptible to erosion and causing compaction of the subsoil. The impact on soil is greater in dry, loosely compacted and exposed desert soils, and less severe in humid soils that contain vegetation. Soil is in fact a living ecosystem and a finite resource, and depending on the ecosystem, it can take 1,000 years to generate just 3 centimeters of topsoil. Detonation can also release toxic pollutants into the environment, which can result in contamination of soil and groundwater. Detonation of explosive ordnance may trigger forest fires, and then these fires can trigger further explosions, which makes it more difficult for firefighters to extinguish the blaze. While it's difficult to provide an annual estimate, there are records of animals, including protected and endangered species, having been killed or injured by explosive ordnance. When an explosive ordnance degrades over time, its casings corrode and hazardous chemicals can leak into the soil and groundwater. This can be conceptualized using the source pathway receptor model, as you can see in this diagram. With the source being the item of buried ordnance, the pathway is the groundwater, which is the route the hazardous chemicals take to the receptor, such as trees and animals, which can then be harmed by the contaminant. While there's plenty of data on this from the military literature, there is limited data from within the mine action sector. We want to stress that it's important that evidence-based decision-making takes place within the sector, which is based on empirical data rather than relying on anecdotal evidence. In Vietnam, MPA is working with a local university who will analyse soil samples in ordnance contaminated areas to better understand the type of pollutants and chemicals found in the soil. This information will then be used to support local communities to make better choices about whether they should grow crops in these soils, and if they can, what crops would be most suited. Explosive ordnance contamination can deny local communities access to productive land. It can also displace these communities into more marginal areas, which can contribute to biodiversity loss, as those communities are forced to hunt wildlife or destroy local habitats for shelter or fuel. In Lebanon, for example, pasture land was left unusable due to cluster munition contamination, which led to overgrazing in accessible areas. There were also instances of local farmers taking matters into their own hands and setting fires on contaminated areas in the hope that this would detonate the cluster munition remnants. Unfortunately, this also exposed the soil to erosion once the vegetation cover was lost. So in this section, we'll look at the impact of land release operations on the environment, the potential impact of climate change on land release operations, and the environmental impact of post-clearance land use. All clearance methods will inevitably have an impact on the environment. And we want to stress that the best way of reducing the environmental impact is to make sure that evidence-based survey takes place before deploying clearance assets, so that uncontaminated land can be released and clearance is targeted only on areas where there is confirmed contamination. There are many factors which are taken into account when selecting a particular clearance method, such as the type and extent of the munitions, the cost, the security in the area, local infrastructure and terrain. Environmental considerations should also be included and mainstreamed as part of the decision-making process. So when thinking about the impact of the land release process and looking at vegetation removal and ground preparation, environmental assessments are generally not conducted as part of the pre-clearance process. So when vegetation is removed to prepare the ground for clearance, this can lead to the removal of rare species or those that are vital to the natural habitat and which can take sometimes years to be restored. Land may still have a high ecological value, even if it doesn't have special recognition as an important habitat. According to the IMAS on environmental management and mine action, the greatest concerns to the environment arise from mechanical clearance and bulk demolition, since these processes can have a severe impact. Machines will have a significant impact on the soil and ecosystem if they are used as the primary clearance method. As is the case with agricultural machinery, they disrupt soil structure, which can accelerate surface runoff and soil erosion, cause the loss of organic matter and soil fertility, and disrupt water cycles, organic carbon, and plant nutrients. Vegetation will also be removed, but potentially on a larger scale than for manual clearance, and the soil will be processed. Heavy machines also need to be transported to contaminated areas in trailers or trucks. And depending on the route taken, this may cause greater damage due to the tracking and rutting of the soil. In a study conducted in the Al Salmi area of Kuwait, it was found that when heavy demining equipment and machinery was used during clearance operations, it caused soil compaction and reduced the rate of water infiltration by up to 97%. Open burning or open detonation remains a widely used method for explosive ordnance disposal, which releases explosive residues into the environment. The contamination risk is highest in bulk demolition sites where repeated demolitions occur, which are also in areas of substantial rainfall with porous soils, a shallow groundwater table, and that are adjacent to marshes, swamps, or estuaries. MAG partnered with Ohio State University in 2018 to 19 to conduct an analysis of the soil around detonation sites in Cambodia following explosive ordnance destruction. It was found that heavy metals in the soil increased by up to 30% following detonation in a 1 meter radius around the detonation point. In addition to the clearance methods themselves, there also may be negative environmental impacts from the establishment of work sites and temporary accommodations to house deminers and other operational staff, from the waste that's generated from the clearance operations, as well as from the repair, maintenance, and servicing of equipment. Land release operations also have their own carbon footprint, which relates to the use of fuel, electricity, and resources in the supply chain. Greenhouse gases are produced, for example, by an organization's fleet of vehicles, by its generators, which are often powered by diesel fuel, by fossil fuel generated electricity in offices and work sites, and by flights, both national and international. Mine clearance programs are already being negatively impacted by the effects of climate change, and this will inevitably increase in the coming years. However, the impacts of climate change are not currently being considered during tasking and prioritization processes, which predominantly are still focused on land use for socioeconomic development. During 2020, central Vietnam was subjected to unprecedented flooding and landslides. Both MPA and Peace Trees Vietnam reported that clearance operations were forced to stand down for several weeks due to flooding. In general, the operators have observed heavier rain and greater flooding in the areas in which they work in recent years, with increased deforestation contributing to greater numbers of landslides. The likelihood in Vietnam is that over the next 20 years, the local population will move from flatter flood-prone areas to higher ground near the borders with Cambodia and Lao PDR. These areas are still heavily contaminated with UXO, but are currently sparsely populated and have not yet been prioritized in clearance strategies. MPA Vietnam also told us that it's building networks and partnerships with local and national environmental and climate change organizations. It's important that national mine action authorities and mine action operators don't reinvent the wheel, but in fact can act as an important bridge for linking communities to the right organizations, integrating mine action response with re-greening and wider development initiatives. Areas may be prioritized for clearance for reasons of socioeconomic development, which means that land release may act as an indirect driver of deforestation and land degradation by allowing areas to access to previously inaccessible land for agricultural expansion and infrastructure construction. If land release takes place in environmentally sensitive areas and in proximity to protected areas of biodiversity, it may encourage agricultural encroachment into these areas and adversely affect local biodiversity. In Colombia, for example, drivers of deforestation are multiple and complex, and it's important that clearance operators are mindful of these drivers. In Colombia, these include the expansion of cow pastures, extractive industries, and palm oil plantations, as well as illicit industries such as illegal gold mining, logging, and drug trafficking. The largest demining operator in Colombia, the National Army's Humanitarian Demining Brigade, has conducted reforestation projects in the departments with the highest rates of deforestation in which they have demining operations. Since 2016, over 290,000 trees have been planted, the vast majority of which they grow in their own nurseries. The Demining Brigade also supports regional environmental authorities with transport for seized animals and wood that has been illegally trafficked. Meaningful consultation with the local community during the land release process is important and can help to reduce the risks to beneficiaries and the environment on which they depend, while improving common knowledge of environmental issues. This could also be extended to the local workforce through training on the IMAS on environmental management, climate change, and basic mitigation interventions, such as improved waste management practices. Landmine clearance can also be used to enhance environmental protection efforts by opening up biodiverse areas to conservation and ecotourism, for example. However, for such programs to work well, conservation strategies and environmental governance must be in place, with clear guidance on the role of demining in this process. In Angola, the Halo Trust is working to clear landmines surrounding the headwaters of the Okavango Delta and establish a series of protected areas which will allow the migration of wild animals throughout the Okavango system. This includes the African savanna elephant. Employment opportunities in conservation and sustainable tourism will also be made available to the local population. In Zimbabwe, Apopo is clearing mines inside the Sengwe Wildlife Corridor. This protected area is aimed at allowing the free movement of wildlife, including elephants, pangolins, lions, and endangered wild dogs, while also increasing the potential for ecotourism in the area. So now we're going to look at norms and standards that relate to the environment and mine action. So there are limited environmental obligations in the relevant conventional arms disarmament treaties. In the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention and the Convention on Cluster Munitions, both require that extension requests must contain information on the environmental implications of that extension. However, in reality, we found that when the environment is referenced in extension requests, it's usually very brief and only refers to how contamination denies access to productive land and natural resources for local communities. The recently adopted Lausanne Action Plan, adopted as part of the Convention on Cluster Munitions, contains 4 actions that refer to the environment and are relevant to land release, which demonstrates that environmental considerations are starting to be prioritized within the sector. In addition, there are other relevant international laws and standards for states which relate to the environment, such as the objectives of the Paris Agreement, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. National mine action authorities and operators must also be guided by a country's national environmental legislation. The IMAS 713 on environmental management and mine action is the only international mine action standard dedicated to environmental management. According to the IMAS, the aim of mine action operations is to leave the environment in a state that is similar to, or where possible better than, before mine action operations commenced, and that permits the intended use of land once mine operations have been completed. National mine action authorities should at the very least have a national mine action standard in place that is in line with IMAS 713. As far as we are aware, there are currently 9 mine or cluster munition remnant affected countries which have an NMAS in place. State parties should also ensure that they comply with the environmental commitments within the treaties, including the guidance under the newly adopted Lausanne Action Plan. We suggest it would be helpful if these NMAS that were made publicly available online to all states, so that good practice can be shared and lessons learned. An environmental impact assessment is an environmental management tool which aims to predict the environmental impacts at an early stage in project planning and design, find ways to reduce these negative impacts, shape projects to suit the local environment, and present predictions and options to decision makers. An environmental impact assessment is a widely recognized environmental management tool, mainstreaming the environment into development projects, and is often mandated by law. It's very comprehensive, and in some cases, the process can take 2 years or more to complete. Environmental impact assessments were used to great effect during landmine clearance of the Falkland Islands and at Skallingen in Denmark. Both were considered to be environmentally sensitive areas with ecosystems that presented their own unique challenges to mine clearance. However, while a full EIA may not always be necessary, it's good practice for organizations to incorporate at least a basic environmental assessment as part of the planning process in mine action operations. MPA has developed simplified environmental assessment and management tools for use by its officers in mine action operations. These can be carried out by a staff member with recommendations to complete the tool before initiating operations or opening an office, and then updating it once a year. These tools have been made available to the mine action sector and can be found if you go onto the Mine Action Review website and click on the box that contains the environment brief. You can also download those tools there for your own use. So now we're going to be looking at some environmental mitigation interventions, some examples of which we gave in the brief. So some organizations, such as Humanity and Inclusion, are making an organizational commitment to reduce their carbon emissions. HI plans to produce a baseline of its total greenhouse gas emissions, and then the effectiveness of mitigation measures that target emissions from, for example, travel and energy consumption can be measured against the baseline. Replacing electricity generated by fossil fuels with renewable energy sources such as solar panels can be one way to reduce an organization's carbon footprint. The Halo Trust in Afghanistan, for example, has 180 solar panels in 7 locations across the country, reducing the energy that is drawn from fuel power generators. By increasing the number of solar panels, in 2020, the program consumed 8,000 litres of fuel less every month at a cost saving of more than $4,000. The proportion of energy generated by solar panels has gone from 18% in 2018 to 32% in 2020. In Laos, MPA has committed to improving its waste management systems by reducing the amount of rubbish it produces through minimizing single-use plastics and reusing items where possible. MPA's officers and field teams separate waste at source, reuse waste as compost or animal feed, or reclaim waste for recycling. For example, by using intermediaries who make a living from collecting and reselling waste. A local youth movement, Zero Waste Lao, found large gaps in knowledge among MPA staff about environmental protection, waste management, and recycling. In response, Zero Waste Lao conducted training where staff learned how to recycle and minimize waste, including setting up their own home composting. I'm not going to go into detail about the role of new technologies in more environmentally friendly land release because Martin will be talking about this during his presentation. Open burning and open detonation remains the primary disposal method for explosive ordnance across the mine action sector. While new technologies are being developed, there is currently no single disposal method which can be used in place of OBOD. Examples of mine action programs using alternative disposal methods include deflagration techniques and explosive harvesting, which can be used to recover and repurpose high explosives with appropriate environmental controls. Cambodia is one of the countries which currently uses explosive harvesting. Environmental certification schemes allow organizations to evaluate, report on, and improve their environmental performance. There are several different certification schemes available worldwide. As we can see from these mitigation examples, there are a number of different interventions already taking place within the sector, and it would be helpful to document detailed case studies of these interventions and others to provide evidence of what has and has not worked effectively and share this knowledge. So finally, let's look at the way forward. So in the policy brief, we draw conclusions and make some recommendations for the sector based on what we've identified as the current gaps in knowledge and provision. I've talked today about some of the recommendations, such as the need for affected states to have a national mine action standard on environmental management, the integration of environmental assessment tools into program planning activities, the importance of community engagement, and of systematic data collection and building knowledge about the environment across the sector. In addition to this, the funding needs to be in place to enable national mine action authorities and operators to mainstream environmental considerations into their program activities and to conduct more systematic follow-up after land is released to monitor environmental impacts. So I want to finish today by posing some questions for consideration. Does the IMAS on environmental management need to be updated? It was published in 2017 and is currently due for review, but does it need to be updated to take changes in the sector more widely into account? For example, should there be a technical note on climate change adaptation within the IMAS? How best can the environmental working group serve the sector? A working group on environmental issues and mine action has been established for a couple of years, but what should its aims and objectives be over the coming year? And would a resource hub be useful? This could be created to share relevant information more easily and make expertise more readily available across the sector and with the wider humanitarian community. And lastly, is there interest in having a kind of longer interdisciplinary seminar on the environment? There is potential to bring together speakers from both within the mine action sector and from external environmental and climate change organizations to speak about some of these more relevant topics in a bit more depth, perhaps over a day or two. Thanks so much for joining us today, and I look forward to hearing from the rest of the panelists.
Thank you very much, Alex. I think that was an excellent overview of the policy brief, and like I say, we encourage people to access it on the Mine Action Review website and take a read. Next, I am pleased to hand over to Linsey Cottrell of CEOBS. Thanks, Linsey.
Thanks, Lucy. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully, can you see that?
Yes, we can, thanks.
Okay, so thanks very much, and thank you to Mine Action Review for taking this policy paper forward, which I think is an excellent step. I want to talk a little bit more, and Alex has already mentioned about climate change, which is obviously timely since we have the UN Climate Conference COP26 in Glasgow in just a couple of days. If you are interested, there is a live stream channel, which I'll put a link in there, which is planning to give a platform to voices from the Global South. So just to reiterate a bit, really, the news is pretty bleak. In August, the International Panel on Climate Change issued a code red warning for humanity. And before this, many governments have already declared a climate emergency, like the EU, the UK, Canada, Japan, New Zealand. And this month, the UK's Environment Agency, which is the government agency responsible for environmental regulation, also issued a adapt or die warning. So it's rare to get such stark warnings from scientists and regulators, but this is because the evidence is there and the evidence is very clear. So climate change, so climate change will impact us all, but many explosive ordnance affected countries are also the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change and have less resilience to dealing with the effects. So on top of the escalating crisis in Afghanistan, it's also bearing the combined effects of climate change and high rates of deforestation. In the east of Afghanistan, up to 80% of tree cover loss has been estimated between 1977 and 2002. And in 2019, just 1.5% of Afghanistan was estimated as woodland. This meant that flooding in 2020 was made worse because heavy rain falling on bare ground or sparsely vegetated slopes can cause flash flooding, since the ground has little capacity to retain water. In Angola, although the full impact of climate change on contaminated areas is not that clear, almost all provinces have experienced severe flooding in recent years. And flooding and landslides can cause mines to move, which sometimes can also result in complex transboundary issues. In 2021, floodwaters in Lebanon were reported to have caused mines along the Lebanese-Syrian border to shift. Although rare, munition stockpile explosions are also linked to hot weather. In Iraqi Kurdistan, an unplanned explosion took place in 2018 during the scorching summer temperatures. And then we have the Sahel, south of Sahara, where there's a problem of an advancing desert. So what does this mean for mine action? So climate change can impact mine action activities, both in how tasks are prioritised and how mine clearance is conducted. But I also want us to think about how mine action can also help communities adapt and cope with these extremes of climate change, like heat waves, droughts, floods, or the increased risk of soil erosion. But more importantly, why should it? And I'm going to try and answer the second question first. So why should we make this an additional burden on the mine action community, even when funding is less available? And of course, this month, the UK government announced its catastrophic funding cuts to mine action programmes from 125 million down to 25 million. So how can these enormous funding gaps be filled? But there is an opportunity here of trying to bridge the funding gap and improve climate resilience for affected communities. This means approaching donors with the opportunity to fund projects which jointly involve mine action and organisations implementing climate mitigation and environmental initiatives. And well-planned initiatives can have multiple benefits to both people and the environment. And there are strong synergies between climate, environmental initiatives and mine action. Both work to empower local communities and both work to secure sustainable livelihoods. So how can this be done? And we're not just talking about planting trees. It could be looking at improving farming and grazing practices, forest management, grassland protection, groundwater recharge or catchment management. But it needs strategic partnerships. There's some traction in setting this up already. For example, Halo Trust have been partnered with a local charity in Somaliland. And when it's done well, ecosystems can be protected, restored or managed, while also providing these measurable benefits for communities. And it's not about reinventing the wheel, it's about working with and supporting existing organisations. And it must be the right scheme. It must be context specific, reflecting the unique environmental setting and challenges, cultural and socioeconomic needs of local people. It could be planting, or it could be natural regeneration. In the Sahel, some tree planting schemes, for example, those under the Great Green Wall Initiative, can have quite high failure rates because of ineffective aftercare. But something like farmer managed natural regeneration can work better. And this is where farmers protect and manage the growth of trees and shrubs that regenerate naturally in their fields. And mine action actors can play an important role in this as part of community engagement element. And that's because, of course, they're already doing this engagement through ordnance, explosive ordnance risk education, community liaison and the clearance activities. And that can help identify these local priorities and communicate these to others. Mine action organisations also typically recruit and train local staff, which can also help to secure this acceptance and success of such climate and environmental initiatives. And of course, as part of all this, early community engagement is key. And the benefits are there, can include reducing deforestation rates, helping to protect wildlife, supporting those sustainable livelihoods, contributing to community cohesion, and providing and building that climate resilience for communities. But there needs to be pilot projects, they need to collect project information, which is going to be useful to others. And this must be disseminated to others to encourage that adoption elsewhere. And this will help to inform funders, decision makers, and especially where donors have just supported traditional mine action programs in the past. So I'm just going to leave you with a few summary points there. And I also just wanted to direct you to just a brief video there, which is by Prepare, which is a climate and humanitarian crisis initiative. And there is a website as well, which at the moment, it was only launched a couple of months ago. It's hopefully it will be populated with more resource material as we go forward, I'm sure. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. Maybe you can put those links in the chat box for people as well. And I think that was an excellent presentation and illustration of how climate change is very relevant to the mine action sector, both in terms of the impact on mine clearance operations and about how we can also assist and importantly work in partnership with local communities and have those strategic partnerships. So next I'd like to hand over to Martin Jebens from ICRC. Thanks, Martin.
Well, thank you, both you and Alex, for the introduction. First, I would like to congratulate you on this policy review, and also thank the Mine Action Review for making this in-depth work. I think it's timely contribution and to increase the awareness on environmental management in the mine action sector. I think we all can agree on that wars threaten the environment and the lives of those who depend on it. Too often the natural environment is directly attacked or damaged during conflict and further impacted by damage and destruction to the built environment. The consequences of these environmental damages for conflict affected populations are severe and complex, threatening their well-being and survival. When combined with climate risks, this makes matters even worse. I think we already heard that environmental consequences are manifold and that they will have a socio-economic impact on both local, regional, and national scale. Though environmental management and climate change adaptation should not be viewed separately. Also, we have heard that the environmental consequences of conflict can contribute to climate change. For example, the destruction of large areas of forests or damage to critical infrastructure can either increase erosion or release large volumes of greenhouse gases. The International Committee of the Red Cross and the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies has recently led the work on developing a climate and environment charter for humanitarian organizations. In this process, more than 150 organizations were consulted. The commitments in the Climate and Environment Charter offer a set of principles to guide humanitarian action in response to the climate and environmental crisis. To turn these commitments into reality, organizations should develop specific and measurable targets and design action plans that outline how they plan to meet their targets. This is much like this policy brief and the IMAS on environmental management suggests. These commitments reflect the need for a better balance between responding to rising needs, but also proactively reducing and adapting to the risk that the climate and environmental crisis already pose and will continue to generate. Examples on that may include scaling up community awareness and educational programs about risks that people are facing, or even incorporating nature-based solutions into programming. Likewise, the ICRC guidelines on international humanitarian laws requirements for environmental protection during armed conflict, long word, also gives recommendations to mine action, especially recommendation 24 and 25. Mine action impacts the environment. Through appropriate assessment and management, we can avoid this and help to incorporating environmental mitigation measures. These include, among a lot of other things, applications of the land release process or by using innovative approaches. The Weapon Contamination Unit at the ICRC is responsible for strategies and activities to prevent and reduce the risk posed by weapon contamination. One of these activities is to use innovation to improve detection of weapon contaminated areas using sustainable methods, which has a low environmental footprint. As an example of this is the use of remote sensing and artificial intelligence, which was discussed in a recent webinar back in April this year. In recent years, the mine action sector has seen an increase in projects and research targeting the use of airborne remote sensing and artificial intelligence. However, the use has not become mainstream in the sector, even though it has quite a large potential to make clearance of landmines and explosive remnants of war more efficient, cost-effective, with a lower risk for clearance personnel, and also having a low environmental footprint. The good thing about these technologies is that they have a potential to improve our capacity to assess needs and to monitor changes on the ground. Examples are identifying objects, identifying signs of potential weapon contamination, and can be useful in daily operations. Remote sensing is also a relatively inexpensive and quick method to survey large areas of land on a variety of themes. Again, due to the low environmental footprint, remote sensing applications support sustainable development and are therefore in agreement with the recommendations given by the Climate Charter I talked about before, but also the well-known Sustainable Development Goals and this policy brief as well. In general, I can say that remote sensing techniques outside this sector are widely used to protect and preserve the environment by providing information that may be used in decision-making to save the environment. Landmines and ERWs are displaced in highly different environments. And for this reason, there's no silver bullet. Environmental mitigation measures which protect the environment in one place will not necessarily have the same effect in another place. And some clearance techniques could actually even benefit the environment. So one example of that is, for instance, detonation craters, which in some areas can work as a good habitat for frogs, but in other areas it will increase erosion. Likewise, the innovation I just briefly mentioned, these innovative solutions will not work in all natural environments as well, but will be another tool in the toolbox of methods we will have to use in different settings. Due to this diversity of environments in which mine action takes place, assessment should, as always, be an important and integrated part of the work. And due also to the fact that environmental protection is very cross-sectoral, stakeholders coordination is crucial to address the threats to the environment. Different actors can contribute with a specific expertise to find solutions that do not compromise the security of staff and cost effectiveness of operations while improving mitigation measures. Finally, just a bit of reflection that mines are cleared so that the population can get access to and use the land again by doing no harm. Not returning the land back as it was before the mines were buried will not benefit the local population who use the land, and the clearance will not lead to an improved life. Therefore, the environmental considerations should be included in the work we are doing. So that's it for me. Thank you for the attention, and thank you once again, Lucy and Alex.
Thank you very much indeed, Martin. I think really interesting to hear about the ICRC Climate and Environment Charter, which we encourage people to take a look at. Maybe you could also post a link to that in the chat box. And yeah, the importance of new technologies and remote sensing, I think, is really good to highlight, using all of the tools in the toolbox to do mine action efficiently and with as little environmental footprint as possible. And also your point about country-specific initiatives and how all of these things we're talking about are country specific to the context we're talking about. So thanks very much for that intervention. Lastly, we're handing over to Tim Horner from Norwegian People's Aid. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you. I'd just like to start, as Martin did, congratulating Lucy and Alex on this initiative and the tremendous research that went into the launch of this paper. And also to the previous speakers, Linsey and Martin, I've learned a lot from that just in the few minutes I've been listening into this. As explained before, I work with the Vietnam National Mine Action Authority, and I'm based in the VNMAC. So other panelists have previously just spoken about global issues and a much bigger, much higher level overview. I'm going to use Vietnam as a case study to explain a little bit about how the environment and mine action is managed in Vietnam. So to understand the situation covering mine action and environmental management in Vietnam, you first need to understand how the national and subnational legal system works. There are 58 provinces and 5 municipalities in Vietnam, and they all enjoy some level of autonomy, with each provincial People's Party in charge of their own administrative area, and they each has slightly different regulations implemented through provincial council resolutions. Despite this autonomy and these differences, they all need to be compliant with the national law, which is of course set in the capital in Hanoi by the National Assembly. However, different provinces manage mine action in different ways. So some provinces such as Quang Tri, Quang Binh, Hue are more advanced in the mine action coordination and thinking than others. And it's pretty much the same with protection of the environment, with some provinces being stricter than others interpreting the national laws. Competing priorities vary in each province. So mine action and environmental management may have less focus in some areas than others. But the overarching environmental legal framework is indeed in place. Responsible environmental management is written into the Constitution and into the law. A few examples as follows. Article 43 of the Constitution states everyone has the right to live in a clean environment, and it's everyone's duty to protect the environment. The law on environmental protection came into force in 2014, and Decree 19 detailing the implementation of this law a year later in 2015. Technical regulations on environmental protection came in towards the end of 2015, and there were relevant penal codes updated in 2017. So it's all in place. The legal framework is in place centrally and provincially for environmental management. Also, the legal framework for mine action is now in place. It took some time to get there, but Decree 18 and Circular 195 came into force at the end of 2019 and really started to be understood and implemented throughout 2020, which of course is when the pandemic hit. So it's been slow, really getting to grips with the decree and the circular. However, these legal documents, these two legal instruments, are supported by comprehensive national mine action standards, and they've recently been reviewed and are currently being revised. The review started in the end of 2019, all through 2020, and they're being signed off as we speak. They're being approved and will be launched very soon. As I say, they're comprehensive national mine action standards, but there's nothing in there on environmental policy. There's no standalone standard or guidance on the mine action sector, despite all the laws and legal framework on the environment. There's been a lot of discussion in the VNMAC recently on IMAS 713, and there's talks of future national mine action standard on the environmental management. As a minimum, the VNMAC want to work towards a national policy that will identify, assess, and document environmental aspects of mine action activities, including formalizing environmental impact assessments, as explained by Alex earlier, and identifying what's appropriate to the environmental context, including the legal and other compliance obligations in accordance with the law that I've already mentioned, clear information on future land use, understanding cost benefits and possible mitigation measures, and of course the mitigation measures that are consistent with the policies that are already in place. So there's an overarching legal framework But without specific direction from mine action operators, however, all the operators of Vietnam currently have or are developing policies. They have the environment management mainstreamed into their SOPs. So the operators, especially the NGOs, are way ahead of us here, really, but not completely consistent. All of the NGOs, most of the operators, fully understand the importance of targeted evidence-based land release, so that full clearance, which is intrusive, again, as explained by Alex earlier, and can be damaging to the environment. And they all understand that full clearance should only be carried out where contamination is confirmed. So survey, which is non-intrusive, is being used more and more effectively across Vietnam to release land that's not contaminated. Methods such as the CMRS, which was developed pretty much in Southeast Asia, I think, and pioneered there by a group of NGOs, is being used more and more widely. This in itself is a big step forward in reducing environmental impact of land release in Vietnam, and has proved both efficient and effective. Again, as already discussed briefly by Alex, one of the mine action operators, NPA, has recently started a small environmental waste management project in the village in Hue province. Part of this project involves partnering with Vietnamese University for soil analysis, which will be and can be relatively easily broadened and upsized and integrated into the National Information Management Database. Vietnam has IMSMA implemented as the national database, but there are other data sets there as well, which all need to be brought together for mapping exercises to gain empirical data on chemicals leaching out of UXO. While it's widely accepted and understood that munitions and explosive residues have the potential to cause long-term harm when released into the environment, there's little hard data. So in Vietnam, we're trying to work towards getting this hard data where we can base decisions on the evidence from it. As explained in the policy brief launched today, common explosives such as TNT, when absorbed into the soil, slowly leach and degrade and form products which may be even higher toxicity than TNT itself. RDX and other common explosives used munitions leaches the soil more readily, degrade slowly, and persist for an awful long time. This has been known for many years in Vietnam, but again, there's no real hard data on this, and certainly not the mapping exercises have not been done. Again, as touched on earlier, this time last year was a typhoon season in Vietnam, and it was the worst, the strongest and the worst impact that many of my colleagues could ever remember. So these chemicals leaching into the groundwater, nearby surface water, are being moved around by the ever-increasing mudslides, floods, and typhoons. This all obviously has a potential to have an extremely negative impact on a community's livelihoods and overall environment. However, without samples being taken and the data analysed, this remains anecdotal. The concept of good data leading to good decisions, policies and practices is obviously well understood in the VNMAC. This leads to good land release methodology, which is one of the most important factors in minimising the environmental damage by the operators. Working on a principle of do no harm and leaving no waste or damage behind, all the NGOs and operators in Vietnam have developed good procedures together with the provincial authorities. So this is working in the field and working from the ground up, from the bottom up. This bottom up process has evolved in the field and will meet the top down process being worked on by the VNMAC, creating synergy between national and subnational initiatives. I think it's quite an exciting time really, where we bring it all together to make it more consistent and more easily measurable. It's still very much a work in progress, but the aim is to have a more consistent approach and best practice implemented nationally by everyone and anyone involved in dealing with Vietnam's explosive consequences of war. that was a little bit rushed, but we were aiming to finish by 11 o'clock. I hope there'll be some questions. There's lots more to discuss on Vietnam. Fascinating, interesting setup of how it's all working, but quite complicated. So that was a very brief overview. Thanks very much. Back to you, Lucy.
Thank you very much, Tim. And yeah, really interesting to hear how it's working on a country level and that national, provincial and local level. Yeah, and great that, you know, Vietnam is considering how to bring it into its standards. We know that many other countries in the region have environmental national management standards in place, and we really encourage all governments to look at the IMAS and think about how they have national standards based on, you know, context-specific challenges. And I think your point on the importance of empirical data and good data guiding decision-making is really important in this context. I realise that we're coming to the end of the hour, but our panellists have kindly agreed to stay on to answer any questions. I realise some people need to drop off from the participants, but we would like to open up the floor to discussion. Clearly, an hour is not long enough to cover all of these topics. It would have been great to hear more detail of each of the panellists, but hopefully we can have a seminar or something in a bit more detail at the beginning of next year, we're hoping. But if now I could just invite people to raise their hand if they have a question, and I can invite them to unmute. I can see one hand up from Jane Strangeways from Halo. Let me just unmute you. Hi, Jane.
Good afternoon, Lucy. And can I just echo the sentiments of the panel to say thank you so much for organising this very interesting discussion. I've learned a lot, certainly, from it. And I know the other Halo Trust colleagues are on listening as well. I've actually just left the Somaliland programme this week, in fact, but we at the Halo Trust have been implementing conservation projects to rehabilitate land after clearance and principally to try and prevent further desertification. I'd just be interested to ask, does the panel agree that this should be a routine activity after clearance where vegetation has so severely been impacted? And I'd just be interested to know your view on that, rather than something which is, you know, an optional. And we've had great success with digging irrigation bunds and reseeding the areas directly after clearance and in consultation with the community, as was mentioned. But I'd be interested to hear your view on that.
Thank you very much, Jane. I think that's a great and very topical question. Who from our panel would like to go first on saying something? Maybe Linsey?
Lucy, and yeah, thanks Jane for the question, and great that you're obviously hit there from Halo Trust with on-hand's experience of this. My argument would be that it's not just where you're talking about severely impacted areas. It can, you know, there's the potential there for extending it into wider than that, because we're talking about a lot of the land can be fairly marginal, and there's an opportunity there to build in the climate resilience wider across the community, and not just specifically in that area where mine clearance has specifically taken place. And as I said, it's not just, and you know, as I mentioned in my presentation, it's not just about tree planting. It's about, and I think you mentioned as well, Jane, it's not just about, there's also the education, training and awareness building within the community as well. Whether it's, and it has to be very area specific, because it'll be very dependent on what region you're talking about. You know, it's thinking about a straight tree planting regime is not going to be applicable in all different regions. Obviously, it's got to be the right scheme for the right place. And I think guidance is needed for this, emphasising the need for getting understanding about the local context as well, by linking in with those the organisations who are already operating on the ground in those regions.
Thanks.
Linsey, thank you so much. That's very interesting. And in fact, to build on what you've just said, further to the environmental projects that we've been doing in terms of the irrigation bunds, we're doing exactly that, branching out into environmental awareness, as you suggest. it is absolutely context specific, but where we can do more than just tree planting and reseeding, we're looking at that as well. So yeah, a very interesting discussion. And can I just lastly add that the idea of having a shared body of knowledge, a forum for us to share our ideas and expertise is very much encouraged from our perspective. And I think if that can be set up, we'd certainly be very interested in being a part of that, because we're learning as we go along in Somaliland. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. Did anyone want to add anything, Alex?
Yeah, just to echo Linsey's point that it is context specific, and that's why environmental assessments are so important as part of the planning process, to really understand the impact of clearance processes in that particular area, and then to plan for the best types of mitigation interventions that would suit that particular area. And that obviously, kind of coincides with the IMAS on environmental management, and the sentiment from there about doing no harm and ensuring that the land is left in just as good or potentially even a better state than before the clearance operations took place. So it's fantastic to hear about the different projects that that you're doing it there in Somaliland, Jane, to kind of think about how you can best work with the community and what you need in terms of mitigation on the land. So yeah, really positive.
Thanks, Alex. Martin.
It's just a little bit of a soil technical add-on, probably, is that if it's in an area in which you rework the entire top sediment, then you will also often see that the distribution of mineral and nutrient minerals are actually changing. So maybe you get a less fertile topsoil, and in that case you will not be able to grow the same types of crops which were already there before your clearance, and you then have to adapt whatever you planned for that reason.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Very, very good point. And I think, yeah, all of this kind of also emphasizes the importance of also working in partnership with expert organizations on these topics as well. Are there any other kind of questions from the floor? We've still got a little bit of time because our panelists have agreed to stay on, and we've still got 80 participants online with us, which is great. So if anyone does want to post a question or to raise their hand and make a few comments, please feel free to raise your hand. I'm just reading some of the chat. I don't actually see any further questions. So if there's not any other comments, if anyone did want to ask a question, please just raise your hand and I can invite you to unmute. No. So I think with that, we encourage people to download the report. As Alex has already highlighted, MPA has kindly made its environmental assessment documents available to the sector to use. They're also on the Mine Action Review website. So we encourage people to look at those as well. And we really hope to that this is a moment that the sector can really start. This is the start of a process, really. This process has already started. It's being developed. We have the IMAS. There's more and more initiatives going on that we know about in different countries, but now I think it's the time to really look at how we can mainstream environmental considerations within the mine action sector. Mine Action Review's currently co-chair of the Gender and Diversity Working Group. We've had that over the last few years, really looking at bringing that as a standard mainstream consideration within mine action operations. And I think the environment is equally as important, and it's a good example of how we can actually and how we should be considering it at every single step of mine action operations, from the planning to the implementation to the post clearance land use. And Mine Action Review will also continue working on the environment. We look forward to engaging with the working group, with all of our partners in the sector, and seeing how we can actually advance this important issue. So look forward to continued discussions and conversations and sharing of best practice. And I'd just like to thank all of our panelists today. Thanks to Alex for the excellent work on the policy brief. And thanks to Linsey, Martin and Tim too, and to everyone that has joined us today. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Lucy.
Thank you, everyone.